Hi students, welcome to Earth and Environmental Science and Module 6 on hazards. This is video number 15 and we're going to be looking at human activity and droughts or floods. In this video, we're going to be investigating how human activities can contribute to both the frequency and magnitude of some natural disasters, including droughts or floods. So we want you firstly to be able to link human activity to natural disasters, to explain how those sorts of activities or different sorts of human activities can exacerbate things like droughts or floods, and also to assess their impact and whether or not we're being successful in either trying to mitigate or minimize the impact of some natural disasters, or whether we're actually contributing to their severity. Now, of course, one of the things that's very important is that we have, I guess, an overarching climate science that we're going to need to deal with that is going to be a contributing factor to some of the things that we'll talk about in this particular video. But that's such an important topic, it gets an entire module to itself, so we will come back to that later on. So let's just see if we can focus on a few of the human activities that are most likely to either increase the frequency or severity of natural disasters like droughts or floods. And the first one, and the most obvious one, I guess, probably, is land clearing. Certainly large-scale land clearing can have a negative contribution on both droughts and floods, both as a result of the ability to hold and retain water, and also what actually happens once water flows through an area, whether or not the soil is relatively well held in place, or whether that just is going to be washed away with the flood waters, and obviously that can cause even more significant damage. One of the things that has happened in Australia is that we see a large amount of the Australian flora and also some of the fauna as well that have built up some levels of drought resistance as a result of population after population, generation after generation, being exposed to these sorts of extremes of conditions. So there's a lot of different types of adaptations that we can see that are about reducing water loss, trying to combat periodic dry conditions. And we've talked about some of these different types of strategies that both plants and animals that are Australian natives have used in order to counter, or at least to cope with, these sorts of extreme conditions when they come through. But one of the problems that we have with land clearing, obviously this is going to be something specifically related usually to some form of agriculture. That could be logging for forest woods, but it could also be about clearing land to plant crops or to run livestock, or indeed both. But the reduction in the amount of native vegetation that we are still doing is causing soil water to be taken up at a higher rate, and this is accelerating the drying of the soil. Australian soils, I'm sure you'll be aware by now, are relatively poor. They're not high quality soils. It's one of the reasons why we do a lot of addition of fertilizers, but also some of what we do can change things like the water table, whereabouts the water is sitting. We know that there's going to be a general level of flow from the highlands to the lowlands towards the sea, but we also know that that water table underneath, where we've sunk a lot of bores in order to try and bring some of that water to the surface, can also be influenced by by human activity, by the amount of water that we're taking, and also whether or not the soils, the rains are coming, and to what level we're losing water from our soil surfaces. So one thing that we can do is to divert water. And this is one of the things that happens particularly in agricultural regions through these open irrigation channels. Now, one of the consequences of this sort of human activity is that this diversion of water away from the rivers into these more open channels can increase water loss through evaporation. In fact, by up to as much as 50%. And this is much more significant if you're thinking about an environment which is already relatively dry and subject to drought conditions, and you're losing a lot more of your soil. You're losing a lot more of your water just as a consequence of how you're trying to divert it, what's happening to the water that would originally be in some of those rivers that's now being used to irrigate farmlands. In addition to these sorts of increases in evaporation, we can also see differences in what's actually happening from wetland systems to increase soil drying. So as we divert water away from these natural water systems, what we're often doing is changing those systems in some way, which means we're upsetting the ecosystem balance. So all ecosystems have some sort of a balance, and that is a result or often can be expressed through the food webs, the interrelationships between different organisms, both plant and animal, that exist in a particular environment. And by changing some of these important physical factors, because ecosystems are a function not just of the living things, but also the physical environment. So when we change the amount of water available, when we change aspects of the soil quality, or when we leach some of the nutrients away, then we're changing some of those conditions. We're potentially changing the producers, which are at the start of each of the food chains, and consequently, we may affect all of the organisms further up those trophic levels. Flooding is also something that we can influence, both in terms of its severity, not necessarily its frequency, but that can actually change depending on some of the dams and things that we might introduce into particular areas. But certainly once rains do come, and sometimes in Australia those rains come very rapidly with very large amounts of water being dropped at over short periods of time, and this can lead to flash flooding. So areas where we have cleared the trees, we're still talking about this aspect of land clearance, a lot of the lower lying shrubs, as we seek to create often monocultures, which are the preferred agricultural lands, where there's just a particular crop, one particular crop. Either that crop is being used as a food crop, and therefore it's being collected and sent off to market, or it's being used as a livestock food, and therefore it's going to be fed to sheep or to cattle. And same sort of problems can occur there. So this sort of clearing of land for agricultural use can also exacerbate some of the issues around flooding when the rains do come. The fact that we've also created a lot of transport systems, we want to get materials from one place to another, especially in some of the areas where we've turned those lands over to agricultural use. We often put hard roads, hard surfaces in, compact the soil, and perhaps lay down bitumen or concrete over the top of it. And of course, that makes them now impermeable, or at least mostly impermeable. Impermeable surfaces are not going to take water into them, which means the water is going to sit on the surface, and it's more likely to flow if there is flooding coming through, and also it's more likely to evaporate when the conditions change and it starts to heat up again. So these sorts of hard surfaces that are impermeable create additional problems for us in that the water has nowhere to go, it just sits on the surface, and so that exacerbates situations associated with flooding, and then it can also evaporate directly from those surfaces too, which means it's not moving into the soils, it's not going to percolate down and create changes in our water table and or increased water availability for crops. As you go through and look at droughts and floods, and these are the things that we've kind of contrasted against each other, just too little water and too much water. And Australia is a country that continually goes through these cycles, and then when we link those up with climatic conditions such as El Nino or La Nina, we find an exacerbation in the either degree or severity of droughts or floods as a consequence, and particularly on the east coast where we are. So there's a couple of important terms, and of course a lot of these have come up in the recent weeks with the east coast lows dominating the weather patterns along the east coast of Australia in March 2022. And so we can talk about flood peaks, and these flood peaks are continuing to change as the flood waters get higher and higher. So the flood peak is usually an estimate of exactly how high the flood waters can reach, and there's a lot of factors that are taken into account. And one of the factors that's taken into account is the catchment area. So the catchment area is basically the area over which all the waters that are falling will eventually reach the same river and make their way to the sea. So a catchment area is basically just a big area of land where any water that falls is eventually going to all flow into the same spot. If it's on the top of a mountain, and it could potentially flow into a number of different areas, either side of the mountain, for example, then we might sort of use that as a boundary between our different catchment areas. But where we've got these lands where there's some rolling hills, or there's some plains, and all of the water that falls all seems to come into the same river that moves through that region, then that's what we would identify as a catchment area. Levee banks can either exist naturally, and often they are under human construction. So we do a lot of levee banks. You sometimes see these temporary levee banks, which are often used with sandbags to try and raise the level against the rising flood waters. Sometimes they're used as barriers to stop the water from coming through, say, into a major road, into a major town centre. And sometimes they're effective, and sometimes they're not. And often with levee banks, we kind of link this term of overbank flow. And overbank flow is basically just what it sounds like. So when the water level in a river, for example, rises, you've got the banks of the river, and usually the banks are giving you those high points. So when the waters come down, the waters will rise, but generally speaking, they won't overflow those high banks. Now, for sometimes, either as a result of the volume of rain that we have, the water that falls on the catchment area, sometimes because of, say, potential blockages, which could be something like a dam, but it could also be things like large amounts of garbage that are just blocking somewhere downstream. The result of the additional water is that you get a build-up of water in behind whatever those blockages are, and as a result that the water will then overflow. You can see kind of from the background slide here that there's water around this really huge levee that's built around this little place. Now, obviously, if the waters continued to rise, they would eventually overflow those banks and they'd come into that little region. And these are all considerations when we're looking at floods and we're trying to figure out what's going on with our potential for disaster as a result of a flood that comes through. We're looking at things like the flood peak, how high the waters are likely to rise. Are they likely to overflow the banks? Do we have sufficient levees in place that we can redirect those waters, or are they likely to break down and we'll just end up with the water in places where we really rather it wasn't? And associated with some of the problems that we've had just recently this year is that the rate of rainfall is so high that it's very difficult to be able to react to these extra waters in time. And so a lot of people have been caught a little bit off guard, and that's created that's turned this hazard into a disaster, with the result of lives being lost and significant loss to properties, to livestock, to animals, to pets, all sorts of things. So this is again where we shift these hazards into the disaster category. So I'll get you to have a look at a particular case study to give you an idea of the sort of things that are happening. And you see these sorts of pictures, and of course we've seen a lot of these on our televisions recently. And with the weather forecast for the next week or so, we may see a little bit more rain. And of course, this is one of the problems. You can have a lot of rain over a short period of time, and if it's very dry and that rain those rainwaters can move through the soils, then you often don't have the same degree of problem. But once there's been a fair bit of rain for a little while and all of the water tables risen, the rivers heights have risen, then you get more rain on top of that, and that can be the trigger for yet another potential disaster. So I'll get you to have a look at the Dungog flood of 2015, and similar to what was happening recently here in New South Wales and also in southeast Queensland, and see what sort of particularly human activity. That's one of the things that we want to try and keep our eye on when we're looking at this particular area of the syllabus, is we're trying to focus on the sorts of things that we have done that maybe have contributed to making this flood more likely or of a much more devastating impact. So that's something for you to have a bit of a look at in class. Thanks for watching.